I had a client just say to me that she said, I'm a disaster. And I said, what? What? Yeah. And
what does that mean?
Yeah. And I said, you know, and I had really just met her, and I said, I don't think so. You know, I know so. You are not a disaster. And I know because of the hope.
Yeah, that God has, right? Okay, so thank you for sharing that. So I think, so you said hope, right? And hope in something bigger than ourselves, right? Not just hope for the sake of hope. So some very kind of significant differences in how we would view counseling in the world as opposed to someone who's a believer. How about we are going to talk about, like, how do we turn that, you know, that person who's really tough to turn? What are some of the ways that you guys do things? What are some of those techniques, right? But what, you know, we have a lot of folks out there, and I'm thinking even of young people who will go to their peers, who will turn on, and I'm not going to say what TV stations, or they'll find different places to get counsel that may not be necessarily healthy, or maybe even having a conversation with a family member, and so I'm not saying that those are not good necessarily, or that there might not be some good things that come out of that, but how might that differ? You know, if somebody says, you know what, I can just go talk to my friend about this. You know, how does that differ from talking to somebody who has the skill set and the license to actually do this work?
Most well-meaning friends and family members.
Well-meaning is the word, the phrase.
Make the same mistake. When they hear a person describe a difficulty, they give them advice. Typically, they ask, well, why don't you just so-and-so? And inevitably, the answer that comes back is, yes, but you don't understand. Or, I've tried it and it doesn't work. Or often the well-meaning friend criticizes, says, you need to spend more time reading Bible and praying. And again, the feeling is you don't understand. So the skilled counselor doesn't fall into those traps, but instead seeks to arouse curiosity in a healthy direction. Like by saying, well, what is this doing to you emotionally inside? So that then they move toward tears. And here is the healing that begins.
Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, interesting. Recently, I had a new office, so I had a friend who's offered to make me a painting. I'm telling you this story for a reason. Like, you're like, what are you talking about?
Okay, all right, I'm ready.
But I asked all my clients, you know, what does this space mean to you?
What does this space?
Yeah, this space. In this room, this space mean to you? And the most common answer I got was safety. It's a safe place. It's a haven for me.
Wow.
It's a release. It's a place where I can come and I can be safe to share what I have. It's confidential, you know, so it's a safe place. And so I want to make a haven. I want to make a place where it's safe enough for them to ask the hard questions, the ugly questions, the dirty questions, the whatever questions, for them to feel safe enough, respected. We talked about earlier about men needing to feel respected. A place where they can feel respected and process what it is that turmoil. So sometimes they themselves don't have the permission to go to those places. Says, you know, like, you know, and so those places, they get dark and tangled and, you know, very tangled. So it's a safe place where when someone, you know, what I said earlier, Isaiah 40, it's a learned tongue, that I would know that the word that sustains them in this place. So I'm familiar with that, the way things work. And so friends are, research shown that, you know, friends can be helpful. Your community is hugely helpful, hugely helpful. But it's just a little bit different.
What would you say, Lynsey?
Well, I don't want to, I want to talk about the community too, but I'm sorry, I just lost
Lost your train of thought?
I did lose my train of thought. Well, what I was going to say is that if friends and family have a hard time not making it about them, and we just go through a lot of training to not make it all about us. Because like maybe friends will track for a while and then be like, you know what, that reminded me of this story that happened, and then all of a sudden it's about them. You know, or like, oh, what you said really affected me because, and then that poor friend really just needed to be heard and listened to. And then they'll go along with the story because they're just chatting, but then they walk away thinking, I didn't really get what I needed. And so we just go through a lot of training just to make it, this is just about you. This is your time. That's why I tell people, what would you like? You know, I give some direction too, but a lot of times I'm, what would you like to work on? This is you. This is your space. This is about you. And I think people feel like this is such a gift. I mean, why can't it be all about us? Isn't that? It just reminds me of just relationship with our Heavenly Father. I mean, really, ultimately, we give glory to Him, but when I'm with Him, I feel like, you know, it's in a strange way just kind of about Him and I, just us.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes. Yeah, there's some kind of exclusivity there, and even though we know He's everyone's Father, you know, but there's something real exclusive about that time when we can just be with Him alone, commune with Him alone, right? So I hear safety, and I hear it's very client-centered, and you know, just having the skill set to know how to communicate properly. I just think it's important, you know, to ask that question, because some folks will say, well, why should I go and pay somebody when I can maybe have these conversations? And yes, having a supportive community is really, it's really important, right?
I want to talk a little bit about the community, that I never really want to replace the community. I think all of us would agree that, that we really want to empower people to go back to their church and their friends and their family, because I never want to have someone become dependent on me.
That's right.
That they wouldn't even seek out friendships because, oh, I just have a counselor. You know, everyone's like, oh, I've got my counselor, then no one would ever like seek out meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem, is that that at times you have a hard time connecting with your community. So you're right, we want to empower, well, I would like to empower my clients to trust other people. That's the whole problem. There is no trust. They don't know how to trust. They've been wounded. There's been trauma. And so in the trauma, there's a lot of things that have thwarted. And so to bring healing so that they can trust and connect in a healthy way, that is the goal. You know, and ours, for me, you know, the safety is a practice ground. We do that with me. This is how we do that. Okay, how can we do that in your church? How can we do that with your colleagues? How can we do that? You know, what is it that what is it that's happening that you can't trust?
And there will be some disappointments because everyone is just sinful. So like your friends are not going to do this perfectly.
Nor will your counselor.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for saying that, right? I mean, thank you. Right. We're all, you know, we're all humans. We have certain skill sets and talents and abilities, and God uses us. And sometimes I wonder why, but He does, you know, and He allows us to come alongside of Him and to be, you know, to be useful and to bless others, and maybe it's because others can relate to us, and but we don't have it all,
and, you know,
and we don't want to create codependencies.
Right, and what's amazing then, okay, well, we just, like, let's say just something, you know, inappropriate just happened, or I mean, I didn't do it well. Okay, how do we process that? Because other people in your life aren't going to do that well. So how do we do that here? How do I maybe just ask for forgiveness, or how does this work, and how do they respond in an appropriate way? It's neat just to see it happen in a safety.
Yes, yeah. Were you going to say something, Dr. Gibson?
I make it a practice to give every client a prophecy, and that is that in years to come, they will be counseling others who come their way. That one of the fruits of them being counseled and going through the hardship and the healing will create in them almost a fragrance of approachability, and that others will come to them quietly, whether they do it professionally or informally. And
so you're a clinical psychologist and prophet, then?
Yes, yes, right.
Is that on your business card? Prophet
No,
Gibson?
I don't want to be stoned.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, were you going to add something else to that?
I think it adds to their dignity.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay, we talked about depression, and I know we touched a little bit on anxiety, and there were some connections there, and I want to talk about that maybe if we get an opportunity. But what is some of the really hard stuff that you see coming into your offices, and you know, and even just thinking about some of those situations where it's just been really hard, and what makes it hard for someone to, you know, to get to that, I don't want to say finish line, but, you know, cross a line or a threshold in their life of healing. Anyone?
Just before coming here this afternoon, I attended part of a workshop on trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of the talk was about combat veterans.
Yes.
And how the therapists working with these cases need therapy.
Wow.
To get over secondary traumatization, because these stories are so heartbreaking. And stories of abuse.
When you say secondary, what do you mean by that?
That by hearing the story, I am partly living the trauma, and I can't get it out of my mind. I lose sleep just like the client is doing. And I need to have someone that I can talk it through with. Fortunately, I can do that with my wife, and she's a good listener. That's another thing. About once a year, I rediscover the magic of simple, active listening, which the famous psychologist Carl Rogers introduced. It is so much what we all hunger for.
Yes, just someone to hear us. Yeah.
Someone to be heard.
Yeah. So post-traumatic
stress disorder, PTSD.
Right, and a lot of our guys coming from war.
Yeah.
But you were talking about this like secondary. So are you talking about like family members?
No,
or?
the effect on the therapist of hearing the horrendous story is that it's like a grenade goes off and we get hit by pieces of it. We're just bystanders.
So what does the therapist do, or the
talk
counselor?
to another therapist?
So that's part of self-care then too.
Yes.
We said we would talk a little bit about that, but so how do you practice self-care? Because that sounds pretty intense.
I do it best in writing.
Okay.
And I do my best praying in writing.
Okay.
I write Dennis, and then I write Abba, who's answering me, and I listen, and the answers that come back to me from God always surprise me, because very often they're whimsically funny.
Probably because you are Dr. Gibson. Does he think you'll respond to it?
I would say a part of me.
Because you had said earlier you learned how to tell jokes, and play the guitar.
Yeah, right. So a part of me is, and I would say it's the Holy Spirit in me talking to the old nature in me. So that it's a way of spiritual growth for me.
Okay, so writing is, so you have like a journal, or just, anywhere? Just
any place.
Any place, okay. Okay, so we can't like go find them anywhere and read them.
I don't keep them.
You don't keep them?
Because
smart.
I've been keeping them and I never reread them. The whole
it's a new thing every day.
Is to get it out.
Yeah, wow, that's great. That's great. What about you, Dr. Caceres?
I think rest and just recreation and your community is just simple things. I agree that there is secondary, I wouldn't say necessarily trauma, but you do feel the drain.
Yes.
When I worked in business before, I was doing trade shows all over in New York and Los Angeles, and then I got hired at a ROF, I remember, and it was in an office, and they said, well, this is a very stressful job. And I looked at them like, okay. But you know what? It's a different kind of stress.
Yes.
And it's just a wearing, draining, kind of thing where you're depleted.
Yes.
Because your attention and your focus and your energies are so intense. And on hearing, you want to hear their stories, remember? And so it is a drain. And so I think simple rest, recreation, time for a good, fun with and connection with other people. I think are just basic things, and not to, of course, to underestimate prayer and solitude, that kind of thing. But which is what that verse that I was talking about earlier alludes to. You know, he wakes morning by morning. It's like I have that so that I can do this other, so that I can do this other part. But I think community is a huge part.